right reasons and in the right way. And here's, in one sense, the main idea that all of this chapter deals with. How do we approach God? How do we approach God? Right? That is the main idea of chapter 20. In fact, we will actually dive a little bit deeper to this because there is a point to why God is saying this. There is a point in why God is giving us this history. Right? And so this right here, their inquiry, it just doesn't matter. At least not to God. Right? God doesn't make any mention to it. Right? He is not going to listen. Instead, what does he give to them? He's going to lecture them. Right? God is going to lecture them. This is like when kids do something wrong and the dad gives them a lecture, except this time it's not kids, it's the elders, and this isn't just any father, this is God himself. And so God is going to give them a lecture, and he wants Ezekiel to get them to understand their past so that they can make sense of where they are at now. Today is another history lesson, and I don't mind, right? I love history, but it's history told to get us to answer the question, how do we approach God? Right? In fact, there has been one other chapter that has talked about the history of Israel in depth. Does anyone remember what that chapter was in Ezekiel? There was one other chapter that went in depth into Israel's past. Does anyone remember? It's the longest chapter we went through. 16? 16, good. 16. 16 was the other chapter where we went over a long list of history there. But now we get into here, and so now I want you guys to focus in on the time in Egypt. The time in Egypt in verses 5 to 10. And Rachel, could you read that for us?
Yeah. And say to them, thus says the Lord, on the day when I chose Israel and swore to the descendants of the house of Jacob and made myself known to them in the land of Egypt, when I swore to them, saying, I am the Lord your God, on that day I swore to them to bring them out from the land of Egypt into a land that I had selected for them, flowing with milk and honey, which is the glory of all lands. And I said to them, cast away each of you the detestable things of his eyes, and do not defile yourselves with the idols of Egypt. I am the Lord.
Stop right there. Sorry. Yeah, we'll stop at verse 7 real quick. So let's understand what is going on here. What does God do for them here? Just as you're reading through verses 5 to 7, what is God doing right here? What do you guys think? Okay, reminding them of the Abrahamic covenant. What else? That's basically it, right? What does the Abrahamic covenant promise? Land, seed, and blessing. Good. Land, seed, and blessing. And so here, God is reminding them of this Abrahamic covenant. But after the end of Genesis, let's understand, do they look like a nation at that time? No, they don't. Right? Far from it. Land-wise, all they had was a graveyard to bury Sarah. Right? And do you think God's promise to Abraham that he would have descendants as many as the stars in the sky came true at the end of Genesis? No. In fact, do you guys remember how many people went into Egypt at the end of Genesis? About? Only 70. Only 70 people went into Egypt. Right? And so when we come now to the book of Exodus, and they are in Egypt, and what you see here in Ezekiel 20, verse 5 to 7, is a summary of all that God had done for Israel in that time. Where Genesis was a birth of a nation, Exodus is the establishment of a nation. If you are creating a nation, real quick, what are three things that you need? You need first a people. You need first a people. You need second a government. And you need third a land. People, government, and land. You need these three things. And so now when you think about this and when you look at this in verses 5 to 7, I want you guys to read that in scope of these three things. Right? Verse 5. On that day when I chose Israel and swore to who? The descendants of the house of Jacob. There's your people. And made myself known to them in the land of Egypt when I swore to them, saying, I am the Lord your God. Think the plagues and the Passover and the parting of the sea. God made himself known in Egypt, didn't he? Verse 6. On that day I swore to them to bring them out from the land of Egypt into a land that I had selected for them, flowing with milk and honey, which is the glory of all the lands. This was land. It was the very best of the best. Right? We often think Israel is the dry, deserty area, but back then it was more luscious, right? A lot more luscious. And so verse 7 comes in and it says, I said to them, cast away each of you the detestable things of his eyes, and do not defile yourselves with the idols of Egypt. I'm the Lord your God. What's God referring to there? In many ways, he's referring to the Mosaic Covenant. He's giving them law and order. Right there, law and government is given. Verse 5 talks about establishing a people. Verse 7 talks about establishing a government, and verse 6 talks about establishing a land. Right, and so what we see here is God slowly building up this nation. Right, but verse 8 comes in, and I want you to see the response of all of this. Verse 8, but they rebelled against me and were not willing to listen to me. They did not cast away the detestable things of their eyes, nor did they forsake the idols of Egypt. Then I resolved to pour out my wrath on them to accomplish my anger against them in the midst of the land of Egypt. Do you guys see the issue here of what Israel was doing and how they actually approached God? See, we're going back to this idea, how do the people here approach God? And the thing here is, what do you see? Israel kept going back. They were like Lot's wife and they looked back. And there's nothing wrong with looking back, but the issue is that they yearned for the old. They yearned for the old. Israel wanted to go back, and in the words of Ezekiel here, did not cast away the detestable things of their eyes, nor did they forsake the idols of Egypt. What a horrendous thing that we see. Can you imagine that? God has shown them all the plagues. All the plagues. In fact, when you look through the plagues, it's all as a battle against some of Egypt's supposed gods. Right? And so he has shown all these miracles. They have seen the walls of the Red Sea encompass them on both of their sides, that they may walk through, and yet they still worshiped the gods of Egypt. It's horrendous. But this is how they approached God. They wanted the life they had back then, and the life that God would have them here, they just wanted everything just mixed. Right? That's the idea. Right? The issue here weren't that the people wanted to subtract God out of their lives. And we have to understand that. The issue isn't one of subtraction here. The issue is one of addition. They were a people who added to God. The people approached God as if, here it is, as if he was a democracy. And what I mean by that, as if they approached him as if he was a democracy, as if he invited others into his own rule, as if there was a system of checks and balances where each branch had a unique set of powers and he was just one out of a bunch. Right? They were just adding to God, in other words, to try to check him. And if we're honest with ourselves, we can often fall into this trap ourselves with how we approach God and treat God, right? As if he's just one cog in the democratic machine. And it's not some other God oftentimes that we add to him. They aren't the check and balance to him most of the times. Often in our lives, we set ourselves up as the check and balance, right? Our emotions checking his word. Our desires balancing his desires. You see that? You know, God, what's showing here is that God doesn't appreciate a democratic system. It might work for the USA. It doesn't work with God. This is exactly what Israel did to God. But here's the remarkable thing. God did not destroy them. Did you guys see that? So something that's so interesting here. God did not destroy them. God did not destroy them. Why? Verse 9. But I acted for the sake of my name, that it should not be profaned in the sight of the nations among whom they lived, in whose sight I made myself known to them by bringing them out of the land of Egypt. So I took them out of the land of Egypt and brought them into the wilderness. God acted according to his own name. In other words, God acted according to what? What's the one word that everything revolves around in Ezekiel? Starts with a G.
Glory.
He acted for his own glory. He acted for his own glory here. Right? And so it was because of his name, and bring out his people would show to the nations around that he was and is and always will be God. Just imagine for 1 second, if God just destroyed Israel right there on the spot for having those other gods, what would Egypt think of him? What would the other nations think of him? Oh, you just brought out your nation and then you just smoked them? Do you think God wants to be known that way? No. Right? And so here, to tear out mere slaves from the greatest nation at the time was to show that God indeed was alive and he was indeed working. God didn't bring judgment and wipe them out. He was patient with them and they kept going. Right? And so already what we see is immense grace. And so we get now to the time in Egypt. Or sorry, the time in the wilderness. The time in the wilderness. Verses 11 to 12, it says, I gave them my statutes and informed them of my ordinances, by which if a man observes them, he will live. Also, I gave them my Sabbaths to be a sign between me and them, that they might know that I'm the Lord who sanctifies them. Here, right here, is the summation of the Mosaic Law. And the Mosaic Law was given right in the wilderness, wasn't it? Right? It's true. God in the wilderness gave them the Mosaic Law. And notice something interesting. That word also at the beginning of verse 12. Do you guys see that word? Here's the implication of that word also. The Sabbath, though one of the 10 commandments, is not a moral law. Right? Let me say it this way. Let me make this a little bit more clear here. Verse 11, he talks about moral laws, right? Right? He talks about moral laws, and then he says 12 also, don't forget, in addition to, which means the Sabbath isn't included in that. The Sabbath he gives to them so that it could be a sign. And that's something that's really interesting. Really interesting thing there is that the Sabbath is quite different from the rest of the 9 commandments. Right? In fact, when you look at verse 12, it is an exact reiteration of Exodus 31:13, where God says, I gave them my Sabbaths to be a sign between me and them. Now, in order to understand this, I want to talk a little bit about, to give a little bit of a lesson about covenants, because I think covenants are really important for us to understand. There are 2 things needed for a covenant. And does anyone know what those 2 things are?
Person 1 and person 2.
Person 1 and person 2. Okay, that is true, but there's something else. What is needed in a covenant? Typically in covenants, there are 2 things. 2 things. The first, I want to say, is blood. Blood. And that's something for us that we don't always think about, right? Remember the inauguration of the Abraham, right? What did God do? Do you guys remember in Genesis 15, God would split a bunch of animals and walk through the halves of the animals? And guess what there was? Blood. Right? And the Mosaic, and back then, what the point of that was that God was walking through that. And essentially, the Abraham covenant was an unconditional covenant, right? It had no conditions on the party in which he was giving that covenant to. What it was saying was that if God broke this covenant, he would be as bad as those animals lying right there next to him. Right? That was the idea. And then we get into the Mosaic Covenant and inaugurating a now new covenant. When we come to the covenants, understand that there was always blood needed to inaugurate it. There was always blood needed to inaugurate it. But there was also something else that typically accompanied a covenant as well. And that second thing was a sign. A sign. Right? And that second thing, a sign, was typically a symbol that carried with it rich meaning. It carried with it weight and significance. For example, every covenant thus far up to the Mosaic Covenant had a sign, right? The Noahic Covenant had what sign? The rainbow. Good. That God would no longer destroy the world in flood by water. Right? And then there was the Abrahamic covenant, which also had a sign, correct? Circumcision. And that would be a reminder to the people that God had cleansed the people and set them apart from every other nation. And now the Mosaic covenant also has a sign. And what is that sign? According to verse 12, what is it? The Sabbath. And so in understanding the Sabbath, it was, and we have to treat it as if carried with it much weightiness. It was a thought-provoking thing. In fact, if you go back to the Mosaic Covenant, if you go back to the 10 Commandments, what you'll find is that the shortest commandment is 4 words long. Thou shalt not steal. But for the Sabbath, 4 verses are given to it with 98 words given to its explanation. Even when you look at the 10 Commandments, the Sabbath was treated as a sign because it carried with it rich meaning. And that's why the commandment, the 4th commandment, starts with it the word what? Remember. Remember. Or in other words, dwell. This commandment is different because it is a sign, and a sign with meaning. So what was the meaning? Well, let's first give a little bit of a lesson about the commandments now. Understand that the commandments typically can be split into 2 main commandments, right? Love the Lord your God. And the second, love your neighbor as yourself. All throughout the Old Testament and the New Testament, these 2 divisions come about. And then from these 2, they are then expanded into 10, right? The first 3 commandments all talk about what? Loving the Lord your God. And then commandments 5 to 10 all talk about love your neighbor as yourself, right? That leaves the 4th commandment, which is the Sabbath. And from these 10, thousands of moral, civil, and ceremonial laws are expanded in the rest of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. So 2 expanding to 10, expanding to thousands. And the purpose of it all is given in Deuteronomy 31, verse 26, which says, take this book of the law and place it beside the ark of the covenant of the Lord your God, that it may remain there as a witness. And here's the word, not for, but against you. That's really important. That preposition, it wasn't for, it was against them. Moses, after finishing the Pentateuch, commanded that his writing be put right next to the very presence of God to stand not as a commendation to them, but as a condemnation to them. Do you understand?